this evening. Last week Larry mentioned that I was covering this topic and mentioned how daunting of a task this is, and I think that that's definitely understating it a little bit. When you think about Moses as a person, right, there's a lot that could be said about this guy. A lot of different times that he's mentioned in the Bible. Larry mentioned before church that he read that Moses is actually listed the third most times out of any name in the Bible, right? So Moses is this man who is recognized among a lot of different types of religions. Obviously Christianity, he's highly praised in Judaism, Islam, right? So this guy is someone that is very well known, for a lot of the right reasons, right? We know him for his leadership, we know him for his law giving, and so we're going to cover a little bit of that this evening. But there was a lot of different directions, a lot of different ideas that was thrown out of how I wanted to kind of go about talking about this. But we thought it would be good, since we are going to be spending, obviously, the next several months going through the account of the Exodus, to dedicate a study to go over Moses as a person. We're going to be talking a lot about him. So ideally, what I'm going to try to cover tonight is just real briefly, who is Moses? Just kind of talking about his birth and just kind of his upbringing and his life as a whole. But I want to spend most of my time talking about the elements of his and God's relationship. As I mentioned, there was a lot of different ways that I wanted to go with this, but to kind of narrow it down, I think that I'd like to spend most of our time looking at this very unique relationship that Moses and God had. Because in a lot of ways it is very unique, right? There's some similarities between his relationship and the relationship that God had with some of the other patriarchs, such as Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and them, but there's a lot of things that are very unique with the relationship between Moses and God. And I want to pull out just a few nuggets. There's about 5 or 6, I think, kind of exchanges between God and Moses to try to help us learn a little bit more about that very intimate relationship between God and Moses. And then we'll lastly kind of look at how his relationship with God should mirror our relationship, and some things that we can apply from that relationship of how God looks at us as well. So, like I said, when we think about Moses, the life of Moses can actually be broken up into 3 different 40-year periods of time. And so just to make it simple, that's how we're going to look at his life here. And so when you think about the first 40 years of Moses' life, some things that we know is that he was born to Amram and Jochebed. So those were his biological mother and father. They were of the tribe of Levi, which is important to remember as we talk about Moses' life later on throughout the account of Exodus. We know that he was the youngest of 3 children. He had a sister, Miriam, and a brother, Aaron, who we're going to talk about a lot as well throughout this study. And we know from the writer of Hebrews that his parents were also faithful. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, it says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and were not afraid of the king's edict." So we see that his parents were people of great faith, and highlighted here. We often think about, when we think about Moses, about how miraculous, the preservation of his birth was. We can read this account here in chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was a fine child. She hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it along the reeds of the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. And she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrew children.' Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse this child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So, we've talked about it a few times in some of our introductory lessons, right? But, Moses was obviously born in a very, troubling time, right? The Pharaohs was already kind of commanded all these Hebrew boys to be killed. And, his mother, Jochebed, did what she needed to do. And whenever he was of age, tried to preserve him, right? She preserved his life. She created this basket out of papyrus reeds and placed him in there and hid him along the bank of the river there. And as she was doing that, she stationed Mary, kind of stood by just to kind of keep an eye on what was going to happen there, his sister. And about this time, it says there that, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe, and she saw the child there. And she had compassion on it. She heard it crying. She, obviously knew that it was a Hebrew boy, just given the circumstances that it was abandoned and the time that was going on. And so about this time, you can see here that Moses' sister went and asked Pharaoh's daughter if, she wanted to go grab her a Hebrew woman to help nurse this baby. And the ironic thing about this is, she said yes, and so she brought Moses' biological mother, Jochebed, to come and nurse her own baby. And I find that kind of funny and kind of ironic, right, that Moses' mother was actually being paid by the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter to nurse and take care of her own son. But that's exactly what happened. And once he was weaned and of age, she gave him back to Pharaoh's daughter, in which he spent the rest of his life kind of growing up in. And so when you think about the first 40 years, I'd imagine as an infant, and the short amount of time that she had with him, that Moses' biological mother shared with him the traditions of their people and their religion. And then likewise, the rest of his life, when he was given back to Pharaoh's daughter, lived, in the courts of Egypt, right? And we can read that, in several passages, but in chapter 7, verse 22, it says, "And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in his words and his deeds." His adopted mother, Pharaoh's daughter, provided him with this, this education above all, this culture and the science of Egypt. You think about just the livelihood, right, that he was living in, this life of royalty, of prestige. And obviously Moses kind of benefited from growing up in that environment. But I also feel like during this period, especially as he got older, really was able to put in perspective the injustice that was going on around them, right? He was able to see how the children of Israel were being treated in their time of slavery in Egypt. And we actually see him act on this injustice a little bit later in chapter 2. He says, "And one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." So by the time Moses got a little bit older, he saw this injustice that was going on and reacted in anger, ultimately, and struck down and killed this Egyptian. And I don't know if Moses in his mind thought that doing this was going to kind of spark an uprising, that the people would follow up behind him. Obviously, there's no divine direction given in this task here. It's simply, he just simply reacted out of anger. And I think this is kind of obviously a small tidbit that we can kind of take from knowing that, it is okay for us to, be angry and frustrated with the injustice that's going on around us, but we still have to react and act in direction with God and His Word. So his plan, if there was one, failed. And so, after he struck down and hid his Egyptian, he fled, where he spent the next 40-year period of his life. And this 40-year period after this time, he spent in Midian. And there's not a lot that is said about him during that time. Actually, there's about 10 whole verses that talks about his time in Midian there. Starting in verse 16 in chapter 2, it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock, and they came home to their father Reuel. And he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son, and called his name Gershom. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." And during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So when you think about this second 40-year period, right, it's not really highlighted in just a lot of text throughout this chapter. It's just this 10 verses, but I'd have to imagine that this period of time was very crucial in Moses' livelihood, because this would have probably been the time where God was really using all the opportunities that he had to train and equip Moses to take on the last 40 years, right? The period of time where we know that he carried out the commission to free the children of Israel. So this period of time was very much a developmental phase where he learned godliness and discipline. He learned the responsibility of marriage and of fatherhood when he got married, had a wife, and they had a child together. This would have been a time where, he, growing up in the house of the priest here, of Jethro, would have learned a lot about, their faith and about God and godliness. And so, all of the lessons that he would have learned and picked up during this period of time obviously would have stuck with him. I had to imagine he would have learned the rigors of hard work, which obviously would be needed as they wandered in the wilderness in the coming chapters. Right, he grew up in the the royalties of Egypt, and so during this time he was a shepherd. Learned how to work hard. Probably picked up some survival skills, I would imagine, that would have translated during that last period of his life. This was also in a general area of where they would eventually come back, and he would lead his children, God's children, through the wilderness. And so he was probably familiar with some of the foot trails and just the general geography of the area that would have been beneficial as well as he was navigating this people. So there was a lot during this 40-year period that I imagine that Moses was learning, that God was teaching him without really even knowing it, to take on that last 40-year period. And that last 40-year period is really the period of his life that Moses is mostly known for, right? This is where he becomes that leader, that lawgiver that we think of when we think about Moses as a person. This period of time is when he spoke to God, and God commissioned him to go save the children of Israel. This would have been the period of time when he did have the showdown with Pharaoh, and led the children across the Red Sea, where he gave them the law, and they built the tabernacle and wandered through the wilderness. This would have all happened during this 40-year period. So Moses was about 80 years old, had a lot of life, learned a lot of experiences before ultimately developing into the role that we know him as. So, like I said, that's a real quick snapshot of Moses' life. And like I said, I want to spend the rest of our time looking at the relationship between God and Moses. There's some nuggets that we can pull out. There's definitely more that we'll discuss, but there's a few things that I think we can highlight, some very specific exchanges between God and Moses that we can learn from. And the first one is that we see that Moses isn't on board with God's plan at first. When Moses, or when God initially commissioned Moses to go and to confront Pharaoh and save his children, initially Moses gives God every excuse in the book. And I'm not going to go into this in very much detail because I think Tripp is actually covering this next week. So we'll learn a lot more detail about some of these excuses. But the point that I want to make with here is that, Moses, when God gave him this commission, wasn't on board. He offered every excuse in the book not to go forward with that. And what's interesting to me is how God was reacting to each of those excuses, right? And just about every single one of them, God was coming back with reassurance. He was coming back with resolutions, right? Moses was telling him, I can't do it because of this. And God said, well, you can because of this, right? And they just going back and forth for several, verses there. And each time, God is just kind of reassuring him, comforting him, trying to, build up his confidence that, things are going to be fine. And it wasn't till kind of the very end of this exchange before it mentions that God actually got angry with Moses. And so, like I said, I'm not going to cover that much more detail, but it is worth noting when we're thinking about this relationship of this exchange between God and Moses and how he wasn't on board with God's plan at first. We also see an account where God actually tries to kill Moses at one point. This is a kind of a small passage in the context of him going back to Egypt the first time. And we read it in chapter 4 and verse 24. Again, he's on his way back to Egypt, and it says, in the lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off their son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone, and it was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. This passage here, to me, when I first read it, just seemed very much out of the blue. It's a 3-verse little section on his way back to Egypt, and even if you look at the greater context, there's not a whole lot that is said outside of this passage here. And so I had to do some digging, and this is probably the main point of the lesson that I'll definitely open to feedback if I'm wrong on this. But from the best that I could tell, the reason that God was so displeased with Moses at this time is because it seems as if his son wasn't fully circumcised, which Moses and his wife would have been familiar with the covenant that God made with Abraham, whereas the Hebrew boys are to be circumcised by the 8th day. And so it seems as if at this time their son wasn't circumcised, so God was displeased. He was angry and even sought to put him to death. And luckily Zipporah, his wife, kind of took care of it and eventually touched Moses and kind of seemed to please God at that time. And so, again, not a whole lot of context, not a lot to say about this, but, again, when you're thinking about the greater context of this relationship, that it is worth mentioning that at some point, Moses' life was at jeopardy because of, God's feelings towards him. There's something else to think about is that God actually Moses at one point accuses God of harm towards his people. So after Moses gets back to Egypt and delivers God's message to Pharaoh for the first time, we've talked about it before, but Pharaoh gets very angry. He gets very annoyed. He greatly increases the work on the Israelite slaves there. He causes them to do more work, cuts off their resources, and just kind of makes it a lot more difficult of a situation than they already were in. And at this time, you kind of see that the children of Israel start to grumble and kind of get annoyed with Moses, right? Just like, why are you coming in here? You're just making things worse. Please go. It was better off before you even showed up here. And after this, rather than going back to God and, expressing his faith and trust in him, Moses goes back and begins to accuse God and actually compares him to Pharaoh in some points. He says, then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. Those are some really bold accusations, right, that Moses is making towards God, right? He's basically saying, you've done nothing to save your people, to deliver your people at all. And, it kind of makes you cringe when you think about it in too much in depth there, but it's something that is definitely worth noting, because obviously Moses kind of, at least initially, struggles with his faith right here, right? He's having a lot of these doubts. He's having a lot of these questions. He's, at this point, accusing God, just not fully understanding the greater picture yet. And which leads into the next point is that immediately after that, God bestows upon Moses a special honor. So it's important to note that not only does God not chastise Moses for accusing him, but God actually reminds him that he's bestowing upon him a very special honor. And this, I believe, is kind of when you start to see this relationship start to shift, right? We see this this kind of embrace that God has with Moses that he hasn't had with any of the other, patriarchs up until this point. At this point, no other person has ever been revealed by God his true divine name, Yahweh. If you read in chapter 3 and verse 13, it says, "Then Moses said to God, if I come to your people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent to me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." And God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, and the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. And this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." He reveals this divine name. He mentions later on in chapter 6 that he says, "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord," or Yahweh, "I did not make myself known to them." So, we see Moses receive kind of this special privilege, right? That even people such as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob didn't get to know God on this level, didn't get to understand this divine name. So God is really trying to embrace this relationship with God. And later on, we even see that Moses, in a sense, even gets to try and see God, right? He wants to see God, and God basically says that, he can't see his face or he's going to die, but he wants to be in God's glory or see in his presence. And so what I found particularly interesting is that in spite of all of these accusations and in spite of all this doubting and this arguing that he's had with God at this point, that God still deems Moses worthy of his divine name and to be in the presence of his glory. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But, when we think about God's relationship with Moses, this is really where I feel like you should kind of see the narrative start to shift. We'll see also, Moses really start to get his faith concrete in God when he starts revealing to him, the different miraculous signs and wonders to kind of really show who he is, right? It reminds me a lot of, when Jesus was, in the midst of his ministry, right? That there was a lot of naysayers, a lot of doubts, and John tells us that the reason that Jesus is performing all of these miraculous signs and all these miraculous events is so that those that might know him might believe that he is the true Son of God, right? And so we see around this time that God starts to do some similar things for Moses, right? He starts to perform these miraculous signs. He kind of bestows upon Moses this gift, and which he would eventually go and show kind of Pharaoh and the children of Israel to boost up their confidence in him. So this is pretty big turning point in this relationship. We also see an account where Moses debates with God, right? He starts to plead with God on behalf of the Israelites at one point. So, after a little bit later on in the book of Exodus, right, we see, Moses lead the children of Israel out of bondage. They're safe from the Egyptians, and they're wandering, and they, once they get to Mount Sinai, later on in the book of Exodus, Moses goes up to the mountain, and that's when he's receiving the law, right? He's getting ready to receive the law from God to go back and deliver to the children of Israel. And while he's up there, he's up there for a long time. And the Bible tells us that the children of Israel begin to grumble. They begin to get impatient. Where is Moses? He's abandoned us. He's left us. Where's this God? We haven't seen or heard from him, and I don't know how long. And they just kind of start to lose faith and kind of get antsy and go back to their original ways. And Matt talked about this a little bit on Sunday morning, right? Of the children of Israel beginning to make that graven image, that golden calf out of gold, and begin to worship it, as Moses is up there. And God sees what's going on. He sees what's happening down there, and he becomes angry, right? He becomes very fierce, and he's ready to, wipe them off the face of the earth. I feel like this would have been a good time for Moses as a mere human to kind of just sort of step aside and say, your will, not mine, right? I'm going to not interfere here. But, that's not at all what we see Moses do. In fact, In chapter 32 and verse 11, it says, "But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent, did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to kill them. I will multiply your offspring, and as the stars of heaven, and all of this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from this disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people." And so here we see Moses, instead of just kind of being quiet, actually to implore and to plead with God to change from his way, right? God's getting ready to, just destroy the children of Israel and their footsteps. And he goes on to tell God why he thinks this is a bad idea. He's not on board again, and he kind of even goes into detail of why he believes that this is a bad idea. He tells God to turn from your fierce anger, to change your mind. If it's any way possible, just do something different. And this exchange, ultimately, it seems to influence God to, relent from this disaster, to spare them, to give them another chance, which is pretty crazy if you think about it, right? That a mere human, and I think this says a lot about this relationship, right? That we're trying to peel back. That Moses felt comfortable enough, confident enough to plead with God and to lift up his request on behalf of the children of Israel. And so that's, Moses debates with God and ultimately kind of gets his way here. And one of the last things that we see, this is obviously going to be at the tail end of our Exodus study, is that God eventually doesn't allow Moses into the promised land. So this is later on in a situation that actually can be found in the book of Numbers, and where at one point as they're wandering through the wilderness, the children of Israel become thirsty, and there doesn't seem to be any water around, and so God tells Moses to speak to this rock, and it'll gush out water, and Moses gets angry rather and strikes the rock twice to kind of get the water out, and this, obviously displeased God. In fact, later in Numbers 20 and verse 12, it said, "And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you do not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." So obviously we'll cover this in a lot more detail in next year, but it's kind of a sort of a bookend, right, to this high-level relationship that we've been studying, right? That after all this exchange, kind of all the back and forth, God tried to kill Moses. Moses was arguing with God. They, embraced, and they had this very intimate relationship, and just all the back and forth. That eventually, Moses is ultimately punished by not being able to see, that Holy Land before he passes. So, like I said, there's a lot more that we could definitely say about this relationship, but I want you to try to think of this, especially as we study the book of Exodus, and you see a lot of these nuggets that we pulled out, and even more that I didn't cover, about how God interacts with Moses and how Moses interacts with God. Obviously, there wasn't a perfect relationship by any means, and there's some things that we can learn not to do, right? But I think it's very unique and kind of very promising, especially when you think about our own relationship with God. And I want to kind of wrap up by just looking at a few takeaways on how this relationship with Moses also applies to our relationship with him as well. And the first thing is that we need to understand that God uses experiences from our past to help prepare us to accomplish his will in the present and the future. I can't help but to think about all of the life that Moses lived prior to this account, right? Prior to him going to Pharaoh and leading the children out of bondage. as mentioned, he was close to 80 years old, right? So think about all of the life experiences, all the things that he learned, all the things that God taught him, in a lot of ways were to prepare him, to make him equipped and be adequate enough to take on the greatest task of his life, right? To lead God's people into the promised land. From all the events to his, miraculous preservation of his birth, to being raised in the courts of Egypt, to rebelling and fleeing to Midian, and just all of the truths that he learned during his period there, to, again, all of the kind of post-Egypt events. This was all to prepare him to take on this task. And, I think, the cliche saying is that, everything happens for a reason. And, I think there's a lot of truth to that. You think about our own personal lives, right? And all the things that we experience and that we go through, both the good and the bad, can be used to as a learning experience, right? They can be used to increase and strengthen our faith, right? When we think about all the good things that we experience in this life, obviously those are things that are positive, and we try to reinforce them, and we keep trying to keep those things happening, right? But even when we go through tough times, when we go through tribulations, when we go through persecutions, if it gets to that, that those are events and those are scenarios in our life where we are expected to learn and to grow in our faith because of those. I think of the passage here in James chapter 1 where he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and that steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And I know this is primarily talking about enduring persecution, but I think the principle still applies, right? That everything that we experience in life, just like all the things that Moses experienced over the course of his life, is to help prepare us to carrying out God's will and God's mission for us on earth, which is kind of a good segue to the second point, is that we need to remind ourselves that our past doesn't disqualify us from our service to God. This is similar, but this is a fundamental theme that is repeated over and over throughout Scripture, right? About God using broken, sinful people to carry out his will. Moses was no different. Moses is obviously esteemed as this faithful leader, this faithful lawgiver, but he had his fair share of issues. He had obviously had somewhat of an anger or an impulse control problem that resulted him in murdering an Egyptian, right? And so he had some issues that he had to work out himself prior to carrying out this mission. You think about other godly, faithful people in the Bible, such as Abraham and David and Paul, and you can go on and on and on about these people that had these checkered past, the things that they've struggled with sin and issues, right? That ultimately they kind of use those to their benefit to carrying out their service towards God. And so I think it's worth mentioning for us here that it doesn't matter what we've done in our past or how bad some of the things that we have done. None of those things will ever disqualify us from our service to God. That there's always opportunity to be forgiven. There's always opportunity to repent, and I think that's kind of an obvious truth here that we learn from this relationship with God. And lastly, we see that God embraces us and wants a relationship with us. You think about it. Think about all the time that Moses spent debating with God, accusing God, questioning God. He's accusing God of being no better than Pharaoh and debating him, asking him to change his mind, to turn from his ways, and all of the back and forth, right? And at the end of this story, we still see this God that's wanting to embrace Moses, that's wanting to embrace this relationship with him. And I think that obviously it's true to us as well, right? Think about all the times that we've spent questioning God, accusing God, doubting, his plan or his will for us, and just some of our darkest moments, right? And where it's just we're not our best. yet at the end of that, we're still left with a God that's willing to reach out to us, a God that's still willing to embrace that and wants that relationship with us, regardless of what it all we're going through at that time or how dark those times get, right? That the same God that wanted to embrace and wanted a relationship with Moses and in that very divine and intimate way is the same God that, we serve today. And so I think it's important for us to remember that as it applies to our relationship as well. That was the study that I had. I hope I was able to present it in a way that made sense and was easy to understand, and hopefully gave you guys some nuggets to kind of keep in the back of our mind, again, as we go throughout the next several months and we study some of these events in the book of Exodus in a lot more detail, encouraging you to keep that relationship, keep that unique relationship in the back of your mind, because, again, just in the same way that God interacted with Moses, there's a lot of truths that we can take from it and apply to it our relationship with him as well. Thank you for your attention. We never want to close, though, without offering an invitation. And so if you're here and you've never been baptized or would like to be baptized for the remission of your sins, we'd like to assist you with that. Or if you're here and you would just like the prayers as well, if you need either one of these, we encourage you to come sit on the front rows as we stand and sing the song selected.